All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Stop, Look, and Listen. I'm your host, LeTroy Gardner. This week, we have an attorney, an educator. She's a TEDx speaker. I mean, she's a trainer and a facilitator. She does keynotes, and she's the founder of TrainXtra. We have Sejal Thakkar. Welcome to the show, Sejal.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh yes. It's definitely gonna be a fun one. It's good to catch up with you, Sejal. We've been kind of working in another arena, trying to collaborate, and you're able to grace us with your presence here on Stop, Look, and Listen today.
Thank you. No, I think we're just getting started with our collaborations because I could tell that we're both trying to make a positive difference, right? So
Definitely.
let's go.
All right, Sejal. So, take us back to the beginning. Give us a biographical snapshot into your journey growing up as a daughter, to Indian immigrants. You're facing a lot of discrimination and bullying. Just talk about that upbringing and how you channel that energy into something positive.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you asking that question. Yeah, so my background, I was born in a suburb of Chicago, a predominantly Italian neighborhood. My parents are immigrants from India. So I grew up as a first generation Indian American. In the town that I grew up in, we were the only Indian family. So you can imagine I experienced a lot of discrimination, harassment, bullying growing up. Some of the stuff that I dealt with was subtle, and some of it was not so subtle, right? So going through that was difficult, but also then I had, sort of a cultural thing that was going on as well. Because again, my parents like literally just moved to the United States, and I was born here, so I was dealing with cultural issues of it being, my being raised in a traditional Indian household and then growing up in an American culture. So there was some different dynamics that were going on. And so I know what it felt. I felt what it felt like to be on the receiving end of those kind of behaviors of, being judged for your family or the way that you look and all those things. And so when I became an employment law attorney, I started seeing some of those same issues happening in the workplace, right? We're dealing with incivility, bias, discrimination, all these things, and it was causing a lot of harm to people. And so I kept finding myself thinking, like, wow, there's got to be a lot of this stuff could be avoided. There's got to be a better way to do this. And what I saw was that a lot of times it was because of lack of understanding, not addressing it properly when it was happening, or doing nothing about it, hoping that it would go away. And then these things never went away, right? So that's kind of what motivated me to start my company in 2017.
Okay. All right. So yeah, just tell us about Train Extra and the services you provide.
Yeah, so TrainXtra is, I started this because as an employment law attorney, I kept thinking that there's got to be a better way rather than coming in when the lawsuit's filed and providing legal solutions. How can I help organizations proactively address these kinds of behaviors that I dealt with, growing up, so that other people don't have to deal with it? And so I initially, like when my son was born, I started doing a lot of your anti-harassment training. I did some diversity inclusion trainings, and I really saw that there were gaps in the kind of trainings that were being offered. And so I really decided that I wanted to focus in on bringing civility as my main, like, sort of lane that I wanted to swim in. And so I provide different workshops, really focusing in on something that I think is overlooked a lot of times in organization is civility, right? And so the way that I look at it, LaTroy, is that civility is the foundation. It's a starting point, right? Without that, we can't have those other deeper conversations. And so I've got a series of workshops really helping people, empowering people on doing their part in making sure that we have more civility at work.
Uh huh. Um, do you feel like that's often put on the back burner, civility, as far as the bottom line? People put the bottom line ahead of just human treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was something, again, as an attorney, I saw over and over again, is that there was a major gap, right? So we were training people on compliance and what do we do if we're dealing with illegal behaviors, but we're dealing with a lot of other kinds of behaviors in the workplace that may not be illegal, but they're still not in line with your core values, right? So we still don't want those behaviors happening. And so a lot of times I feel like organizations, because they don't see a quick return,
Hmm.
right away, that they're short minded, and they're looking for that immediate return rather than really focusing in on the fact that it's going to enhance your employee morale, your productivity, your level of innovation, creating that sense of belonging. So there's a lot that comes along with civility that I think that organizations weren't empowering people, right? Because it's sometimes it's scary to confront these situations, right? Because let's be honest, in a lot of organizations, incivility has become normalized,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm saying, let's flip that script, right? We don't want incivility to be normalized. So that requires having a lot of tough conversations to say, what's really going on in our organization and creating those safe spaces where we can talk about that,
Right.
right? And have open dialogues about what's really going on. And so, my workshops are never the same for two different clients because every client has their unique diversity within their organization. They've got their own challenges, right? And so, part of what I do is making sure that I customize my workshops to meet the client's needs. And again, no two organizations get the same workshop because they've got different issues that we want to make sure that we address. Because at the end of the day, if people don't feel safe having discussions about what's really going on or what's not going on that should be going on, right, then we can't address the problem. We can't get to the root cause of what the issue is, and then that's when things spiral into lawsuits, and then we end up in court, and then nobody wins, right?
Uh-huh.
So
It, do you feel like the workplace is the ideal environment to fix our civility problem as a society?
well, I think it's everywhere, not just in our workplaces, right? But I chose
Hmm.
the workplace just because that's a smaller universe, but really it's got a ripple effect, right? It boils down to, especially like in the world that we live in right now, where we're dealing with global companies, people working remotely, some people working in the office, we need to know how to connect with one another, right?
Hmm.
And that when we don't see eye to eye, like how do we handle that situation? And so it's something that it's not just in the workplaces, it's in, just look around, right? Like what's going on in the world. But of course, if we each take ownership and take accountability for our own actions and the things that we're doing that are impacting those around us, then that's going to impact more than just the workplace. It's going to impact our community at large, right? And so the work that I do within the workplace, I think is important to get us started on that. But it's all about empowering people to how do they lead, right? And the way that I look at it is we're all leaders. We're all impacting people around us. So if we can lead better, and we have those tools, then we could be the role models, right, for other people to do the same thing.
Right. I'm glad that you mentioned leader. We're all leaders, but in
Hmm.
a work environment, leadership often plays a pivotal role in fostering a civil workplace.
Yeah.
How do you work with leaders to ensure they set the right example?
Yeah. I mean, no, leadership's absolutely right. They play a pivotal role because they set the tone for the entire organization, right? And so their
Hmm.
actions, their words, their behaviors have a ripple effect on everybody else, right? And so when you have good leaders that are modeling civility, right, and so that sends a powerful message to the rest of the organization that this is a value that's not negotiable, right? And so I'm out there urging people to make civility one of their core values and then making sure that you define what that is, right? So I do a lot of leadership trainings where I create workshops for those leaders to help them define what civility might mean for their organization and how that they can implement, right? Because you want civility to be a part of your day-to-day interactions. A lot of times organizations will have core values, but they're not lived values on a day-to-day basis. And so, it's not just about defining it or having a core value, but then it's teaching people, how do we implement the core values throughout the entire organization? And so a lot of the trainings with leaders that I do is self-awareness,
Mm-hmm.
right? We guide leaders through doing a lot of self-reflection exercises to increase their self-awareness, and then helping them recognize like how their actions, because they're leaders, they have power. That's something that the people that they manage don't have. And having that power is going to impact people around them. So really helping them understand accountability, for what they say and what they do. A lot of it's emotional intelligence too, right? Like getting people to understand that as a leader, how do you demonstrate more empathy, for example, right? How do you manage conflicts constructively when they're happening on your team? And how do you navigate difficult discussions or situations? People don't get trained on that, right? A lot of leaders get promoted up because they're doing a good job, but that doesn't know they know how to lead people, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, working with them on developing those practices, and then again, I do my civility workshops, and part of that is also unconscious bias and helping people understand, how to recognize that we all have conscious and unconscious biases, and it becomes really important to the civility conversation, because if you've got hidden biases that you're not aware of, you can unintentionally negatively harm people around you, right? So a lot of civility is talking about, okay, how do we empower people so that they can start doing the work on themselves to understand what their own biases are, and then how do they mitigate those?
Right. Yeah, I like that. Um, how do you address the resistance? Because I'm sure not everyone, you know, uh, you know, takes this, with open arms. There's going to be some pushback here and there,
Yeah.
maybe from leadership or just from like HR themselves. Like, how do you break down those barriers?
Yeah, that's this isn't easy work, as far as what I'm trying to do, right? A lot of it is data, right? There's a lot of data out there that shows, and we're talking a lot more about it, but that demonstrates that when you have incivility in your organization, how that negatively impacts collaboration, morale, retention, right? Innovation, inclusion. There's a lot of data out there that says that when environments have civility within their organization, that it triples, quadruples sometimes some of these business outcomes, right? So I always come back to sharing that data with leadership to try to overcome any resistance that I might find. But also, I think it's real world examples, right? I've been a lawyer, so I've had the front row seat to working on cases where there wasn't incivility, right? So I incorporate into my workshops a lot of storytelling using real world examples to bring those concepts to life, right? So
Hmm.
so it's not that I'm just speaking from a place of this is what we should be doing. I know I've been there. I've represented companies. I've represented leaders. So I know what it looks like when it doesn't work, right? And how costly it can be. And then I guess I would also add that, a lot of what I do, honestly, is also acknowledging the resistance, right? So I think my approach is a little bit different, because I don't want to run away from the resistance. I want to say, let's talk about that resistance. The elephant in the room, let's not, it's right there. So let's just talk about it. And so when I meet with leadership, before they're going to hire me to come in and do a workshop, I can pick up on that resistance during those meetings. And I want to create that space where they can share that resistance with me. Tell me about the fact that you're a skeptic, why that is. Let's have that open dialogue, right? Because I think what that does is it makes people feel comfortable and seen to say we can be respectful even if you've got resistance or you're skeptical about this. I have respect for your perspective, but let's talk about how we can align with what your goals are. And so I create those spaces all the time where I'm like, tell me what you're dealing with and what are you doing about it and why is it not working? So a lot of the resistance happens through creating those spaces of having that open dialogue.
Right. Yeah, and I'll say like specifically, at the company that I'm with, there's always, massive turnover. Like people are coming and going, and
Yeah.
there's somewhat of a culture established, but with so many moving pieces, it's hard to maintain. I'd say that mission uh, or core values
Yeah.
throughout all of those changes. So,
Hmm.
do you feel like that also throws like a monkey wrench into, um, the training and implementing a culture that will be tried and true moving forward?
Yeah, of course. I always tell the companies that I work with, this isn't a one workshop kind of thing, right? Like this is something that you want to keep that conversation going. And so that's why I've got a series of 8 or 9 different workshops that I've developed. And I
Hmm.
always recommend let's continue to build on each workshop because what the mistake that I've seen a lot of companies make is they go into a lot of tough conversations, but they haven't set up that foundation yet, right? And so when you don't have that solid foundation, you can't really get and create that psychological safety for it to be effective, right? And so you want to continue to build on the conversation. So usually the first workshop that I talk about, it sets that whole entire picture. Here's the big picture. Here's what we're going to be doing together. And then we break it out into different workshops, right? And I'm also, I'm now that we've got technology in the way that we do, I'm going to start looking next year. That's on my list of things to do to scale my business is like, how do I leverage technology so that we can make this more accessible to people globally, right? At on demand and all that other stuff that technology can allow us to do now. But I also think it's important that people within the organization continue to have these conversations long after I'm gone,
Hmm.
right? So I can come in and do the first series of workshops, get everybody on the same page, set up that foundation, and I can come in. So I've got clients that I've been working with for several years, right? Where I go in a couple times a year and I work with their teams. And then I always tell them, okay, now the next time until from here to the next time I see you, you should be doing a couple of these conversations. Like, how are you going to do that? Right. And sometimes I'll help them create some suggestions and some workshops that they can lead internally. And if they want me to, of course, work with them, I'm always down for that. But again, this is an ongoing process. And you mentioned a really good point about turnover and people, leaving. And that's happening even more now, right? We're seeing layoffs. And every time a person comes and goes from an organization, that's going to impact your culture. And that's why it becomes even more important is that you're continuing the conversation and you're continuing to make that a part of the way that you do things, especially if you're starting off with a culture that's already got a lot of incivility that's become normalized. You have to keep that work going even longer because you got to make everybody that either stays or comes into the organization be aware of the fact that civility is a core value and this is how we're going to be doing things going forward, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Your work kind of reminds me of like a Gordon Ramsay or Robert Irvine when they come into a restaurant and it's like struggling and they put their work in and get it up and running, and you're doing that with businesses like share a success story of you accomplishing that, taking a company that was like totally like dysfunctional and getting it to the point where it was like night and day. The civility
oh yeah.
was through the
No,
roof.
there's so many like stories, right? Because it's not about it going night and day, right? Because again, it's going to take a while to see the results. But I'll share one example, right? I just talked about this. That's why it's on the top of my mind. I gave a disrupt HR talk in San Francisco, and this is the story I shared during that presentation. Was that I was dealing with a company, it was here in the Bay Area, a tech company, and they were like literally drowning in high turnover, right? They were just dealing with a lot of turnover, and it was exactly to the point you were going at. And so they brought me in to do some civility training, and I remember like halfway through the session, I noticed this man, and he was kind of like leaning in his chair. You know, he had his arms crossed. I could see he was like visibly disengaged in the training, and he had that like that. I called it the universal "I don't want to be here" look, right, on his
Mm-hmm.
face, right. And so during the break, I went up to him, and this literally just happened, right, like last year. And so I during the break, I went up to him and I said, "Hey, you know, you look a little frustrated or distracted. Like, what's on your mind, right?" And he was like, "Well, Sejal, you know, like, no offense, you know, I've been managing team for over 15 years. I don't need another training session to tell me what I already know." Right? And that's what he said. And it's not the first time I've heard that, right? I've heard other managers tell me that. And so, you know, I could have easily like brushed him off in that moment and just left it at that, but I didn't, right? And so I tried to connect with him, and I told him about like when I first started practicing law and how I used to think like knowing the law was enough. You know, as I know the law, and that's when you're managing people, you realize like you need to know a lot more than just what the law is, right? There's a lot more to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I told him about a case that I worked on a while back, like when I was still litigating cases where a company, a manager who had some incivility going on in his team, ignored it because he didn't think it was a big deal, and how that one situation turned into a lawsuit that cost the company almost $1 million, right? And so I'm telling this guy about that example, and we just by the end of that conversation, he wasn't just listening; like he was literally engaged in the conversation. It was a complete 180 after we got back in the workshop. He was asking questions now. He was focused. He even started mentoring one of the younger managers, right? So this all happened. And then 6 months later, the company's HR director called me, and she's like, "Sejal, I don't know what you said to him." Right? She goes, "He's a completely different leader now." And I said to her, I go, "What do you mean by that?" You know, she goes, "The morale on his team, the morale on his team has gone up, and the turnover in his department has gone down by 40%." Right. So that's just an example of how it can make a difference, right? Like how this can make a difference. And that's just one. I mean, I've got so many feedback evaluations from companies that I've worked with that have come back to me and said, "We got raving reviews because this is the foundation." But the thing is, we can't assume people know how to behave in certain situations or what to do. And that's what I kept like dealing with over and over again. And I'm like, I'm just going to train people how to do this, right? And so it's not easy though, because there is a lot of resistance, you
Uh-huh.
know, and when you're doing the work. But it's so rewarding when you have those kind of moments where you can see that light bulb moment and it turns that person around. Like that's the reason why I do this stuff, honestly.
Right. Um, what personal growth or insights have you gained through
Mm.
your work with Train Extra?
There's so many. You know, I think I always say like resilience is my middle name. You know, I think that Train Extra, like this was something, you know, I never really wanted to have my own business,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because my parents had their own businesses when they were, you know, when they came into the country, they've had their own businesses. They've never worked for anybody else except for a short time at the very beginning. And so I always felt a little bit of resentment about that because they were never around. They were always working. And so I always had a negative bias against having your own business. And so when I went for it, you know, there's been a lot of times where I've doubted if I wanted to do this, you know, and sometimes it feels like you make one step forward and you know, you take 20 steps back and you feel like you're swimming against the tide a lot of the time with the work that I'm doing. But I feel like I've gotten really resilient in that, and that it's made me even more, you know, stronger in the mission that I have. That it's like you got to be persistent. You know, when you're doing something that's challenging, sort of the status quo, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult, and so I don't know what the end point looks like. I just want to make an impact, and I'm continuing. I'm going to keep doing that, and we'll see where it goes, right? But like I that's really why I do this stuff is
Uh-huh.
to make workplaces better because I know what it feels like when you're feeling excluded or you know made to feel like you're you know like you said the marginal other, right? Or it's like you know when you've been there, you develop that deep sense of empathy, right?
Hmm.
And I think that that's lacking. And I try to weave that into all of the stuff that I do is teaching people, look, be empathetic,
Right.
right? And do your part. So yeah, that was a long answer, but there you go. That I would say resilience would be one of the biggest insights I've learned.
Yeah.
Dr. Todd McLean provides periodontal and dental implant services in 2 convenient locations. They offer over a decade of experience treating patients, and appointments can even be scheduled in the evenings, weekends, or early mornings. Give them a call in Chapel Hill at 919-537-9774 or in Durham at 919-484-8338 or visit them online at gumsandimplants.org.
Nah, that wasn't too long. Because I mean, questions just popped in my head based on that response. So, like, if you were employed in a work environment that was that needed your training,
Mhm.
like how would you navigate that?
If I was in a workplace that needed my training,
Yeah.
well, every workplace needs my training. I'm serious. But no, I really do because I've seen what kinds of trainings are being offered, and some organizations do more for their leadership team, but not for everybody else. And that's the major problem. Is like we're giving some information to some people, but not everybody. And everybody needs to know this stuff, right? Every
Hmm.
organization needs to know this stuff. I think the biggest thing, I guess what I'll say is that, it starts at the top and you have to get the buy-in. So if I was working for an organization that needed my training, I start at the top and I would get the buy-in there, right? And again, using data, using real life scenarios. I work with clients all the time. I told you the same thing. Like I'm happy to have a call with their leadership team, right? We got to get the buy-in right from the top, deal with that resistance, right? Because it starts with the leaders. We've seen that happen all day long, right? Where leaders say they care about culture and then they act completely opposite. What happens in those situations? What happens? Nothing
People
good.
are, yeah, people end up like losing faith in
Mhm.
leadership, quiet quitting, which is a
Yes.
phenomenon. Um, the communication is off. I'll say,
Mhm.
like, in my personal situations, when I have a great relationship with leadership, like we can talk about things outside of work. Like I'm
Mhm.
invited to dinner or
Yeah,
they're invited to my wedding. Like we have a relationship that extends beyond
sure.
nine to 5 hours. The ones that aren't quite as successful is pretty much just work related banter, and even that is kind of kept at a minimum. It doesn't seem like a welcome place to approach this person.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And that's it. Civility is all about making time to be present, right? Not making assumptions, but actually making the time to understand where that person is coming from. I think what a lot of people do is we tolerate each other, right? We put up with each other, but we don't really make the time to get to know each other. And like what you said, is if you make that time to get to know each other, guess what? You're going to have that person's back when they need you on a weekend. You're going to step up and do more than what you're hired to do outside of your role because you have that connection with that person, right? You're going to give up a holiday with your family and help your organization because you have the same values. You connect with them. There's a sense of belonging there. You feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, right? All of that only happens if there's a basic level of commitment to civility. Is that no matter what happens, right? This is the thing when you asked about TrainXtra, one of the things I've learned, like every single kind of company, whether it's your own company or you work for somebody else, there's going to be those high pressure sort of situations that happen everywhere. If you learn how to address those high pressure situations in the right way and you consistently respond to those, you're still going to deal with those, but your reaction, the negative impact that might have is going to go down over time, right? Because people will trust each other. It's when we don't trust each other, where there's that distrust or where there's a lack of sense of belonging. That's where you see these companies get stagnant. They're not innovating. They're not moving anywhere anytime soon. They see that turnover. I mean, just think about the numbers. This is what I do when I'm getting the buy-in, right? How much money are you spending on getting the best talent in the door? You're spending X amount of money to get this person hired, get them onboarded. And now if this person, after, it usually takes about a year for that person to even start getting comfortable in their role, what if they turn around and walk out the door the next day because they're dealing with a toxic environment? You've just spent all of this time and money on training this person, and now they're going to take all of that to someone else. Nobody wants that, right? But if they don't have that commitment or that, role modeling by the leadership that reinforces that civility is the basic expectation that everyone's going to get, they're not going to feel that safety. Psychological safety can't happen if you don't have civility. Right. So anyway, obviously you can see I am super passionate about this topic because it's there's so much we can do proactively to change it. Right. So, yeah.
When did you feel like, civility was thrown out the window? Like, can you pinpoint it? Do you feel like it was like social media's boom, or do you say like maybe the 2016 presidential election? Like, when do you think that happened?
There's no point, honestly. There's no point in time. I know I could speak of when I started my business. Like, I've been seeing incivility since I've been working as an employment law attorney. Now, when I started my company in 2017, it was right after the Me Too movement. And it was really being highlighted, the incivility that was going on during the Me Too movement. So I remember that as being a big event, right? But since then, there has been so much that's happened in just the last few years that has caused incivility to skyrocket. Pandemic, the wars that are going on, the Black Lives Matter movement, the multi-generation, workplaces, the presidential elections, the list just goes on and on with what we've seen. So it's funny because not funny, but I did a presentation for another group a couple of months ago. And the first half an hour was the discussion about why incivility has gone through the roof. So there's a more need right now for this conversation, even more than when I started. And it was very much needed when I started, but it's more because of just the things that have happened in our world.
Yeah, exactly. And when I was in college studying media ethics, we were always taught to avoid politics and religion. Now, today it seems like it's expanded, like with sexuality, human rights, race relations, immigration, like they're all lightning rods. Like, and you were speaking earlier about like biases, conscious and unconscious biases. Like, how do we like stop having these biases that impact the way we treat others?
I'll address what you said at the first part of your question because it's important. I feel like that some of the damage that's happened is because we've got these protective categories under the law that says we can't talk about certain things, right? And so these conversations that need to happen are not happening because people are told you can't talk about that. I don't agree with that mentality. Now, I'm not saying you can make racist comments at work. I'm not saying that. But I think you can have a conversation about how different races impact different people differently, right? And how their lived experiences are going to shape the way they look at the world. I think those conversations need to happen and they're not happening, right? So that brings us to the bias conversation. It's like that's a conversation that needs to happen in every organization to talk about bias, what it is. Most people don't even know what bias means. When I first learned about it, I didn't know what it meant. And this was way into my legal career. And as soon as I started learning about it, I was like, what? Everybody needs to know this at a basic level. I'm not a neuroscientist. And if you were to ask me about the different parts of the brain, I could probably not tell you everything. But I know enough that I'm like, every person on the planet needs to know what unconscious bias is, how it works, and how it is a part of who we are, and how our lived experiences impact the way that we look at things and the way we perceive things. And that because we're all different and we've all had different lived experiences, our biases are also going to be different. So,
Mm-hmm.
at a very minimum, you got to give people the tools to learn what their own biases are, and then give them the tools to some strategies so they can start mitigating those biases, right? And this is exactly what I talked about in my first TEDx talk, right? Is about unconscious bias and how important that conversation is.
Okay. What does the following quote mean to you? Bias blinds us from the beauty in our differences.
I love that one. Yeah. It's true, right? I think people, every single human being is beautiful, right? But we've seen information in our families, our religions, our cultures, our upbringings, where you live. All of these things impact how we view another person. A lot of that stuff happens automatically, right? Because there's a lot of data that's coming at us constantly. So your brain's creating all these shortcuts. So, some of the research, out there says like you see somebody, you don't even know them yet. You've never even talked to them. And because of the way they look to you, you're going to make a bunch of judgments about them. 7 judgments. I think it's 11 judgments in the first 7 seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of it's going to blind me to who you really are if I'm only judging you based on those biases, right? And so that quote is just means a lot to me. I know I post about it all the time because it does. It limits our ability to see people's talents and their motivations and the person that they are if we don't understand that point, that that's just our perception. That's usually not the truth because you don't
Mm-hmm.
know that person. So how do you know who they are if you've never even made time to connect with them, right? And so
Right.
a lot of people just write people off based on those assumptions they're making rather than making the time to get to connect with them and get to know them.
Yeah. What do
Yeah.
you see? What do you see when you look in the mirror, Sejal?
What do I see when I look in the mirror?
Yeah.
I mean, I always tell people when I look at myself, I do a lot of mirror self talk actually now, more as part of my meditative state and part of what I've done as part of my healing journey. But I first and foremost, I always see a mother, because my son is the center of my universe. So that's the first thing I always see when I look at myself is the mother that I am to my son, right? That's the first thing. But yeah, other than that, I, I don't have any like, every time I look at myself, I see something different. Right. Because I'm always like learning more and more about myself. So I'm always like reflecting on what am I seeing when I look at myself. It's always different. It always changes, except for being a mother. That's always going to be consistent, right? That's always going to be
Right.
there. But yeah. How about you? I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you see?
Oh man. Let's see. I see um, just a humble,
Mm-hmm.
uh, caring individual, just striving to uh, make an impact on those that he encounters on a daily
Mm-hmm.
basis and provide a voice to the voiceless.
Ooh,
Um,
love that.
I think, I think especially where I was born, like in Beaufort, South Carolina, like a lot of people just they never thought they never envisioned leaving their hometown or
Mhm.
um, feeling like their voices were heard. And I just think that, especially with this platform, I provided an opportunity for a lot of people from my backyard to gain exposure and um, just the things that I've accomplished. It's
Mhm.
it's unfathomable.
Mm.
It's unbelievable. But yeah, when I look in the mirror, I'm just proud. I'm proud of where I came from, who I came from, and I just look to continue to make an impact the best I can.
I love all of that. That's
Yep.
wonderful. You should be proud, right? I mean, I just posted about that because I just had my birthday last week, and
Happy belated.
Thank you. And I just posted about that. And I go, I am proud as a simple fact that I'm still here.
Oh yeah,
I made it, right? Like we made it. And it's just sometimes it feels like I'm just getting started,
yeah.
right?
How long did it take for you to figure things out?
Hmm. I'm always learning. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say that I've figured things out, right? I'm always
Uh-huh.
figuring things. It's a work in progress. But I'll tell you, when my son was born, that light switch inside of me went on, right?
Hmm.
Like it's always been there, right? The light's always been there, but it was dimmed, it was turned off. And the minute it was literally like I laid my eyes on him and that was it. It was like that was my role, right? That's I'm going to give him everything that I wish I had or
Yeah.
should have had or expected to have. And I've done that. I've done that. I've always made him the non-negotiable, like with all my business decisions. I probably would have had a lot more money had I continued practicing law and followed that track. And so I've happily sacrificed and would do it all over again to have the opportunity to be his mother. But that was the one moment where I'm like, all right, the light switch is on now. It's not just about me anymore. It's about me and him, and that's where the everything changes. And it does. It reminds you, of the fact that what sometimes seems like a little impact is actually a big impact, right? And
Yeah.
so I have to be the role model because he's watching everything I do. Right. So
Hmm.
there's very little room for error, and it's like, now I'm like, well, mommy's not perfect. He's like, nobody expects you to be perfect, but you're like, when you're a mom, you're always striving to be right for them. Well, yeah, anyway, so that's a whole nother topic. We can have a conversation about some other time.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. What's next for you then?
Yeah. So, next again, I'm from a business perspective, looking at ways to leverage technology is something that I'm finally like, okay, I am excited to look into of how do I, people have always come to me throughout the years, like, have you created online trainings? And I just have sort of not been ready for it. But next year, I'm going to kind of start dipping into that and figuring out how I can make a bigger impact. And then just again, work wise, train the trainer programs. So again, it's all about making a bigger impact. How do I do that? How do I get on bigger stages where I can talk to more people about this information? Right. So,
Hmm. All right. So, where can we find more information about TrainXtra?
yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. If anybody is listening or watching this and has any questions or wants to learn more, I'm very active on LinkedIn. And then I've got my website, which is just trainextra.com. It's www.trainxtra.com.
All righty. All right. If you want to close us out with a parting shot, I'd love to hear what you got to say about whatever's going on, either in today's political environment or just whatever's on your heart.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that people need to be more aware of the fact that the way we treat each other matters, right? And so one of the concepts that I talked about in my first, I think it was my first one, TEDx talk, was this idea of shifting away from the golden rule, right? Which is where I treat you in the way that I want to be treated. That's kind of how we've all been raised. Treat other people in the way that you want to be treated. Whereas the platinum rule is about treat people in the way that they want to be treated. Right? So it's a shift, and it sounds simple, but it really is moving beyond yourself and treating other people and putting their needs and perspectives in front of yours, or at least considering them. Right. So it challenged us to go beyond our assumptions that we make, because it's easy for us to say, this is how I want to be treated. But it really forces you to kind of understand the person you're dealing with and how do they want to be treated with respect. What does respect mean to them? How do they want to be treated with kindness? Right. And so I'm going to just leave it at that, is embrace the platinum rule. Right. And when you're interacting with people, and you'll just see the difference that it makes in your relationships, right? Whether it's at work or personally or wherever. Right. So I'll leave it with that.
All right. Well said, Sejal. Wow. Thank you for your time today.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Yeah. So, as she said, you can find more on trainextra.com or catch her on LinkedIn. She has a lot of valuable insights posted daily on there as well. Um, thank you for your time. Thank you
Thank you.
for the collaboration, the inspiration. Like you said, the work that you're doing is pivotal to today's environment. So keep
Thank
up the
you.
good work.
You
And for stop,
too.
I will try. I will try. All right. So for Stop, Look, and Listen, I'm your host, LeTroy Gardner. See you next week. Peace and blessings.